In the beginning is the body. In the beginning is the body. I exist as a body. And I exist as a body within the body politic, which is the group of citizens in my part of the world. And each of those bodies exists on this planet and this universe that the feminist theologian Sallie McFague called the body of God. The universe and even this earth can be seen as the body of God. And within the body of God, we exist as bodies in relation to one another. We'd much rather see ourselves as minds in relation to one another. But there has been way too much focus on the mind and not enough on the body. In fact, the mind probably doesn't even control your well-being as much as you think it does compared to your body. Think of how much more difficult it is for our minds to force our bodies into feeling something than it is for our bodies to force our minds into thinking something. I cannot think my stomach into hurting unless I find a very complex way to do so. But when my stomach hurts, it makes me irritated. But we don't want to accept that. We want to proclaim, I think, therefore I am. But that could be really difficult. And believing in I think, therefore I am is also what makes getting old really frustrating. As our bodies begin to weaken and therefore decide more for us, we begin to feel like more and more of a failure, unable to think of what we want to be into existence with our withering bodies. When we begin to come down with an illness, we perceive our symptoms as, I'm getting a sore throat, my head is starting to hurt, my stomach is starting to hurt, my back is starting to ache. Isolating each physical defect and trying to remedy each individual defect until we're no longer able to, and we have to give in and admit, I'm sick. In that moment of surrender, we can no longer say things like, yeah, my stomach is hurting, but I'm doing this thing still. We have to resign and accept that my body parts aren't sick, I'm sick. We hate to admit that there are experiences outside of our mind that shape us. They shape our life trajectories and shape even the moment you're in right now. But we don't like thinking about all that because we don't like thinking about our limitations. And we have this screwed up view of health as the absence of bodily limitations. And it makes sense that we'd think like that in this capitalist individualist society that determines our value based on our productivity. But that isn't the only way of viewing health. In fact, it's a very unhealthy way of viewing health because we all have our limitations, and that's okay. It doesn't necessarily mean you're unhealthy. The philosopher Ivan Illich defines health as the process of adaptation, the capacity to adapt to a changing milieu, growing older, convalescing, suffering, expecting death. And I like that understanding of health a lot more, and it sounds a lot more true, especially when we consider our bodily limitations. We often don't seek solidarity in our limitations, and we too often seek solidarity in our triumphs in order to feed our ego. Like, yeah, only me and a few others experience these triumphs. And our capitalist system is set up to serve an ideal humanity with no limitations, ignoring the limitations that we all face. Again and again, we have made the mistake of focusing too much on the mind and not enough on the body. Here's my friend and fellow YouTuber and critical theory and philosophy nerd Theory Pleeb talking a bit about the mind before we delve any further.
Let's say that you have a map for a city. You need to find a bus stop. You need to find the times that the buses are running on. But the map that you have for the city, accurate in all of its details, doesn't have the bus stops on it. Why is that? Well, this is actually a map that is being used by people who work at the fire station. And they just needed to know where all the fire hydrants were. So that's what the map's doing for them. Okay. Knowledge is the stuff on the map. Conceptual frameworks and the concepts that we utilize are the maps. Maps are not the territory, though. And the question is always going to be, whenever you're doing intellectual work, what's the goal? What's the purpose? What are the driving questions? And how does a focus on one thing exclude other things? Okay? There's been this idea since modernity, embodied in Kant's little article that he wrote for a newspaper in response to someone one time who asked, well, what is enlightenment? Everyone keeps talking about enlightenment, but what is enlightenment? And Kant kind of responds to it, where enlightenment is taking responsibility for our own immaturity. It's the idea that every individual could eventually get on the same page if we were to develop the right curriculum. If we had the right reasoning trajectory, it would get us to where we all need to be. Well, famously, he was in support of colonialism. You know, writing his works from close enough to the heart of empire, right? Just like how this video is coming at you straight from the heart of empire as well. Out in the middle of nowhere with no real internet. But, still, nonetheless, here I am. And James Scott comes along and writes this book called Seeing Like a State. Does a fantastic job. I highly recommend you check it out. It's a lot more accessible than something very difficult like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Seeing Like a State makes the argument that it's not just, the map's not the territory that undermines certain knowledge projects, but that the way that we get so full of ourselves and so confident about how scientific we are can really hurt the cause when we're trying to better the human condition. Okay, this book's called Seeing Like a State, How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed. If you're one of those people who wants a leftist critique of Soviet Russia and Mao's China and all these other really big social engineering projects, look no further. Check this out. This book is used a lot in post-colonial or decolonizing work because he develops a pretty rigorous theoretical argument against what he calls high modernity or high modern science, as opposed to other kinds of knowledge that are important too, right? So I want to say, like, Heidegger's Being in Time is often where I would go for that critique of modernity. But the fact is the reason I'm recommending Seeing Like a State, beyond the fact that it's so much more accessible, is also just that it's full of examples. And so one example, I think this is in New England, the Native Americans, they were teaching pilgrims, I presume. I'd have to revisit the last page, but or the last chapter. But they were having a real issue planting corn, right? If they followed the almanacs from England, then it was not working out for them, because when to plant the corn and how deep to plant the corn and all of this stuff, like, it just did not translate well or transfer well to the soil on this continent. And so they learned from the natives, though, that you wait to plant the corn until the leaves of the oak tree are the size of a squirrel's ear. And this is not the kind of knowledge. This knowledge is true. This knowledge works. This knowledge saved their lives, but it's not a form of knowledge that is reducible or easily assimilated and appropriated into high modern royal science. High modern royal science is, it has to work everywhere, right? Some things only work here, some things work there. High modern royal science, in modernity, is what works everywhere. It's controlling for effects everywhere because it's about the expansion of empire. And our preconceptions and the ways that we fetishize knowledge acquisition, or the idea that if you just read more theory, then you'd get it all figured out, and then you'd know. No. These kinds of things are blown to smithereens by this post-colonial kind of theory. That doesn't mean we have to give up in trying to improve the human condition, but it does mean we have to remember that overemphasis on some goals to the exclusion of other ones can make it so we are unable to comprehend really important aspects of life that, if we accidentally ignore or eradicate, can lead to large portions of, groups being completely snuffed out, whether it's species or other ethnicities. Like when we're talking about people who are very removed from local situations, making decisions that they think are for the benefit of all, there can be huge oversight when they're really removed from the situation. So that's why you should read James Scott, or listen to him. Or maybe now that I've told you this, you go, oh, I don't need that. Okay, maybe you don't. I'm not here to tell anybody that they need any book. But if you do want to check out some of the ones that I talk about, come on over to my channel. Say hi in the comments. Damon, thanks for having me on. It's great to see you. As always, look forward to our talks. And can't wait to see this video. Bye!
We so often have focused way too much on the mind and the intellect, and not enough on the body and action, which ends up excluding so many people who do not have access to the resources we have in order to improve their intellect. I think a lot of us end up communicating this idea without even realizing it, that social change will come through everyone intellectually engaging with a set of intellectual ideas through studying and engaging with complex theories. People approach theology in that way, acting like the more evolved Christians are the ones who can study and even teach very complex theological concepts and dogmas. And people approach politics in that way, acting like we need to get everyone to read and understand Marx's Capital Volume 1 in order to move into socialism. Now, most people would never say something like that, but that's the message that gets subtly communicated when we belittle people who are trying to spread socialist ideas but don't really know theory all that well. We end up preaching this idea that ironically is kind of narrow-minded, as Theory Pleeb said, that every individual could get on the same page if we just develop the right curriculum. That everyone can be like Kant if we just give them the right intellectual resources to do so. First of all, not everyone can be like Kant, of course not. Second of all, why should everyone try to be like Kant? Why is high intellectualism the goal? So many people in both theology and politics conversations end up inadvertently communicating that all humans must strive to be deeply intellectual first and foremost, and that will lead to the good changes that we need. We seem to have lost touch with the truth that intellectualism is actually a gift, and instead we can see it as an almost totalitarian requirement of all people. I believe intellectualism is a gift that people can engage with, but particularly the people who can and want to teach complex subjects. But here's what needs to be understood. The role of a good teacher isn't to teach the student everything that the teacher knows. The role of a good teacher is to teach the student what the student needs to know. And the teacher is deeply studied and researched, not so that they can teach all that study and research or make their students do all that study and research, but so that they can know plenty of ways to teach people what they need to know at different points in their life. Both me and Theory Pleeb were actually talking one day about how strange it is sometimes when people ask us for general reading lists and nothing else, because the first question we want to ask is, well, what do you want to know? What are you trying to read about? We really want to ask them about their life, where they've been, where they're going, what they want to learn, and then, only then, can we actually recommend a book. Recommending Peter Kropotkin's bread book to everyone actually just applies to a certain group of people. No matter how many times you say, but it's pretty short and easy to understand. That book is short and easy to understand for deeply intellectual people. Let's get this straight, people. We need what is talked about in the bread book, not for everyone to read the bread book. Get that straight. The role of the teacher is to discover what the student needs to know next and to help them on their way to that. And oftentimes that doesn't even look like recommending a book. Sometimes it just looks like telling them to join a union, like the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, or telling them to check out their local DSA chapter, the Democratic Socialists of America. There are all kinds of ways of getting people on board with a larger message that doesn't involve engaging in deeply intellectual stuff. We must start off these important conversations by acknowledging that we exist as bodies in relation to one another. The philosopher and social scientist Alfred Schutz described the beautiful limitations of our organizations of consciousness, saying, "The wide-awake man within the natural attitude is primarily interested in that sector of the world of his everyday life, which is within his scope and which is centered in space and time around himself. The place which my body occupies within the world, my actual here, is the starting point from which I take my bearings in space. It is, so to speak, the center zero in my system of coordinates. Relative to my body, I group the elements of my surroundings under the categories of right and left, before and behind, above and below, near and far, and so on." We may read that and be reminded of how self-centered humans can be, only seeing the world from the perspective of our place in it. But I believe starting there helps us see that we all start there when we begin to engage in new ideas. And so when we try to open people up to new ideas, we need to start from where the person is at. The Twitter homie Young Simba once tweeted this, quoting a humorous summary of what we often hear from people who say they're not really into politics. "I'm not really into politics. Anyway, let me tell you how much I hate my job, my boss, my landlord, my shitty health insurance, my student loans, my town's public transportation, and the fact that I come home too tired to do anything after work every day." So good. We've all heard something like that, right? And usually when someone says something like that, you shouldn't then recommend them a book. Perhaps that person should read a book you want to recommend them eventually, but that's actually a leap from where they're at. We need to begin by understanding that we are bodies in relation to one another, and each of our bodies needs space in this world in order to survive. So part of that space includes the basic necessities for survival, like food, water, housing, safety. Embodiment is the experience of feeling ourselves within our body, experiencing ourselves as a body. And embodiment begins by paying close attention to our bodily needs and our bodily limitations. That's also why we really need to listen to our disabled comrades and friends who do not have the privilege to ignore their body's needs and limitations the way that others do, which enables them to be deeply aware of how our plans for progress can ignore and dismiss a whole host of needs and limitations. The post-colonial feminist Sarah Ahmed, in her book The Cultural Politics of Emotion, argues that politics comes into play when uneven flows of power determine whose pain is recognized and whose is not, and in what way and to what extent. And that's an excellent place to start. And that's also why so many marginalized people care about politics so much. Because they're trying to change policies that do not recognize the pain they experience through their marginalized status, while the privileged and powerful can say things like, I don't know why people talk and care so much about politics these days, because they're privileged and powerful enough to be able to say that sentence with ignorance. For so many people, politics is nothing but a conversation. Nothing but talking points in the marketplace of ideas. But for so many others, politics is about their very survival and their desperate need for necessary space in this world. It's about food, water, housing, healthcare, living wages, not to being abused and murdered for who they are. These are the big problems in our world today, filled with so much poverty and violence. But when you ask the privileged and powerful what the big problems are today, they say stuff like this.
In today's society, it's 2019, your opinion, what are the 3 most pressing obstacles that we face as Americans?
Okay, well, I think the number one issue that comes to mind is the inability to have conversations.
Conversations. I understand this whole argument that our country is so divided these days and we can no longer have conversations across the aisle. But when you actually ask people about actual policies, the conversation looks totally different. When you survey people about their political party alignments or their alignments with certain politicians and candidates, of course, we look very divided. But when you ask them about actual policies, the majority of Americans actually lean more progressive. In approval of things like free universal health care, free education, higher taxes on the rich, higher minimum wage, and that we should do something about climate change. A lot of these people will vote for politicians that are against those things, but only because they are convinced that that politician's platform will in some way help their material conditions, even though they disagree with them on a lot of other things. That's how Trump got elected. We need to talk more about politics as a form of survival, and we need to talk more about theology as a form of survival. We need to talk more about bodies. Pope John Paul II actually developed what he called a theology of the body in a series of 129 lectures that he gave in the early 80s. But really, a lot of it was just about marriage and sex. And also, the language was very transcendent and not imminent enough, in my opinion, for a theology of the body. And really, the whole thing was just a very complicated justification for his argument against contraceptives. It was a very complicated justification for the control of women's bodies. I grew up in evangelical purity culture where the body was talked about in a similar way. We would only talk about bodies when we would talk about how our bodies can be used to sin and to act against the will of God. And it was usually always sexual sin and sexually acting against the will of God. We didn't really talk about how our bodies can be used for love and justice and within the will of God, unless we were talking about sex within the confines of a heterosexual Christian marriage. And really, for almost its entire existence, the church has had a very lackluster understanding of the body. The feminist theologian Elisabeth moltmann-wendel wrote a book called I Am My Body, A Theology of Embodiment, which is a great intro to this stuff. But in there, she says that there are 3 recurring trends over the centuries that have shaped Christianity's ideas about the body. 1. Adaptation to the social expectations of the body. 2. The norm of the male body. And 3. Acceptance of the body in marginal movements, which kept breaking through. So in the first century, the adaptation to the social expectations of the body was in the context of the unique Greco-Roman dualism that saw the soul and the body as opposites, the Stoic sexual ethic, which saw the purpose of sex as strictly procreation and not pleasure, and the Hebrew way of thinking, which saw the soul and body as so united that they still followed very strict Levitical laws that determined cleanliness or uncleanliness depending on what you physically touch or even if you had physical defects. The first century context of the norm of the male body is a lot more believable when we're talking about the first century, but there was even language at the time when a woman would take on a role usually led by men. They would say that she was becoming a man. Like in the Gospel of Thomas, which didn't make it in the Bible because it was written a little bit too late, but the writer of the Gospel of Thomas writes about Peter saying, Mary should go away, for women do not deserve to live, referring to Mary Magdalene. And Jesus replies, see, I will take her and make her male, so that she too becomes a living spirit who is like you men. Oh man, so problematic to read that in today's context. But that was how they talked back then with the norm of the male body. And of course, the context of the acceptance of the body and marginal movements that kept breaking through is the acceptance of the poor, the sick, and the foreigner in Christian communities. And today, the adaptation to the social expectations of the body, the norm of the male body, and the acceptance of the body in marginal movements also still shape our ideas of the body. And I wish more people understood that those things also shape the way that we read about bodies in the Bible. They create the lens that we read the Bible with. And I wish Pope John Paul II understood that as well when he was giving those lectures. Over the last few decades, we've begun to understand the significance of our bodies. We're beginning to understand the idea that I am my body. And we're beginning to understand even how much the body holds. The body keeps the score, as the trauma researcher Bessel A. van der Kolk titled his recent popular book. People are starting to realize how we treat our bodies and how we relate to other bodies matters. Saint Francis of Assisi, one of the most famous saints from 13th century Italy, was so connected to the earth and all its creatures that he called everyone and everything brother and sister. It's one of the things he was most famous for. He would say brother sun and sister moon, brothers wind and air, and sister water, brother fire and sister death, and he even called his body brother ass. St. Francis died at the age of 44, very sick and unhealthy, after committing his life to intentional poverty and service so much that he ended up abusing his body and not even accepting good food and care when he really should have. And shortly before he died, he actually confessed how badly he had mistreated Brother Ass. And he actually apologized to his body, to Brother Ass, and asked it for forgiveness. I believe St. Francis discovered so much deep, great wisdom throughout his life. And then at the end of his life, realized that he missed out on so much wisdom that he could have discovered through his body, through embodiment. So many of us live severely disembodied, seldom paying attention to what we can learn from our bodies and experiencing ourselves as a body. But we are beginning to discover the significance of embodiment. I actually think this is why yoga has become so popular in the West, because so many people are beginning to realize their desperate need for embodiment in our intellectual obsessed society. My friend Frank is a yoga instructor, and I've got to witness him learn so much about himself and the world from simply stretching And I feel like there are deep pieces of wisdom that I've discovered through intellectually engaging with some things, while my friend Frank has discovered those same pieces of wisdom through stretching. And that's made conversations with Frank pretty interesting. And so I figured you all need to hear Frank talk about stretching as well.
Jason was like, oh, we have a yoga class on Wednesday by Ellen, and I really like her. Like, you should come. Like, you can be my guest, and I'll get you in for free. I was like, free? All right. And so I came, and the first yoga class I ever took, it was so struggling. And I remember just being in a standing like lunge, and we weren't there for like longer than a minute, but my leg was shaking. And after the class, like I just felt really good, really loose. It wasn't like the longest shavasana, and I hadn't like broken down like why I liked the way I felt yet, but I just knew that I liked the feeling after stretching for that long and like moving my body. And then so like I immediately got a membership to the gym, started coming a lot, started taking as many yoga classes as I could. Just hungry for that feeling again, because I just really liked that feeling after a practice of just like coming like where I am now, I understand that it was just like the clarity of mind that I was feeling, and like the just like connectedness to my body that I was feeling, that I really enjoyed, because I'd been so detached from all of it. But back then I thought it was just, I liked the workout, you know? And then I heard about this teacher training in Pismo. It was at Harmony House. And I was like, oh, it sounds like something that I really want to do, because I just want to know more about this, you know, because I felt like I was just doing the same thing every day, kind of flipped my view on that. And then growing out of that and growing into more of like teaching yoga, it's been more of that thing of trying to take people somewhere, and not that's a really bad word, take people somewhere. We're trying to like lay down breadcrumbs for people to follow, you know. And so because like the biggest thing that I've learned in like teaching yoga is you can't teach anybody anything. You just got to allow them to come and accept it for themselves, because that's where the real practice is in those moments of them accepting it and them having these tools and these things and actually like getting along there. And because that's where the big release is, and that's where they actually get the moments of like dropping out and then coming back in, is where they walk out, you know. It's where they have all the opportunities. So it's just been setting up spaces and setting up sequences that allow someone to get connected to their body, get connected to their breath, and then from there we can turn that focus inwards, because like if you can get someone focused on their breath, or on how their feet are moving, or how their ribs are in relation to, you know, their stomach, you could get them to think about, you know, what's going on in their lives, what am I really holding on my plate, what's more coming up right now, what's present. Like something as simple as a back bend, if you're disengaged in your core and your pelvic floor, like you pull structure from places that are actually going to hurt you. But if you're engaged in just that simple place of your pelvic floor, even though you're nowhere near like stretching there, it pulls everything else into alignment. And it's so crazy how just like something as simple as like pulling your pelvic floor up and breathing expands just the rest of the body. You get more shoulder mobility, you get more hip mobility, you get more just like mental awareness. You get you're able to stack the line in a handstand or an inversion, whereas if you're not, you're more banana backing. And I'm still working on that and bringing my hips over and keeping that kind of active engagement. But it's the first thing that comes to mind when you tell me that is something as simple as pulling your pelvic floor up is just detrimental to every other posture that you go into. And then beyond that, like breathing is detrimental to everything that we're doing. And that was a big thing too, just like really feeling my breath for the first time. I remember so vividly, there was this one class where this teacher was so good about cueing breath, like inhale, do this, exhale, do this. And she gave us enough time to have a full inhale, a full exhale, and never like too much space to where we felt like we needed to break her cadence. And so it was the first time I had ever like really had a breath to movement practice for the whole time. And I remember halfway through, I was like so just lightheaded and like just feeling like I needed to like breathe in more, but I was breathing in, and I needed to like, as I was breathing, I was like, I need to breathe out. But like, it was just like, as I stayed with it, and then just the things that came after in Shavasana, just like so many, just like breakthroughs in just how I was feeling in that moment. And I was going through some things, and I just like had gotten just this big clarity on it. And it was something as so simple as like, you're creating this. But like, I saw in just clear as day, like how I was creating this. And it wasn't like I had to think about it, or it was just something that kind of came up. But I really attribute that to the breath awareness, and that I was able to cultivate one pointed focus, drop everything else that I was doing, and then have this thing that was troubling me that I didn't really know why it was troubling me, or why it was like constantly just kind of egging at me. But it just kind of like, I was able to listen. And so it was crazy how something as simple as breathing like just unearthed like months of trauma, or months of just something that I was working through, you know, and just a simple movement practice for an hour, you know. And just from there, like what's been crazy of like the more interconnectedness of all of this is that like how I'm moving, how I'm breathing, how I'm actually sitting directly correlates to how I'm going to feel and how I'm feeling right now. Because like when someone's down, they'll hold themselves down. And when someone's like happy, man, they might puff their chest out. Or someone's prideful, they might puff their chest out, you know. But like, and then you see that they're lacking, they're trying to expand, where they're not just like standing in themselves, they're expanding, and they're like this. And you know, you could see it. And it's like how we hold ourselves and how we choose to breathe and how we choose to do all that, it directly correlates to how we're thinking and how we're processing this, you know, and how much we're really taking in. Because a lot of it, like, we don't listen, you know. We're a society now growing that it's hard for us to listen. It's hard for us to hold our attention span for longer than 30 seconds. You know, it's hard for us to do these things, and mainly it's because we're not breathing. You know, we're so unconsciously just go, and then we wonder why our attention span's short. Because like, oh, that was like 10 breaths, but really if you're breathing in like 5-second inhales and then 5-second exhales, that was only like half a breath, you know. And it's like, and when you really just slow down your breath, you slow down your heart rate, you slow down your like brain function, you slow down all of these things, and you could start to remap neural pathways. And so it gets into that thing of like, breathing is now interconnected to how our brain's functioning and how our brain's like setting up like shortcuts to get somewhere. And so so more often than not, we set up these shortcuts to like feel bad, or to like, we're so quick to anger, and we're so quick to just like anxiety, and we're so quick to depression, and we're so quick to like that loop. But like, that's only because that's where all our energy's going, and that's where our pathways are being built. And you know, and so just like reworking all of that through just something as simple as breathing, it's just like big kind of thing that kind of came to me. And it's just like, that's why I feel like when I try to teach other people, it really starts with like, we'll seriously sit there for like 15 minutes and breathe, because it literally takes that long for someone to drop everything that they're doing and just sit there with their eyes closed. And you can tell, you can visibly see it and energetically feel it if you're an empath, that they're there, you know, like whatever's doing, they're like, they have to scratch their face, they have to kind of scrunch their face. But like 5-10 minutes later, if you just really tell them, like, you kind of inch them along, kind of just cue like moving their stomach, putting attention to like different things with the breath, imagining the breath, the imagery of the mind is a really helpful tool to like get more one-pointed focus and drop the kind of like chatter that we have going on. But like, it's so crazy to see that transition in people. And I think that's where, like, as a teacher, that's where I've like kind of put my focus and I put my energy, is in connecting people with their breath, and then we can start moving. Because like, that's the biggest thing, is like, if you're breathing, you're gonna move well. And even if you're not moving in these like super grand postures, like how it is for your body, it's informed. And it's if you keep doing this, like, it gets better. Like when I first started doing yoga, I couldn't touch my toes, you know, like I couldn't, I couldn't do anything. And then like going into like inversions, like I used to hate shoulder stand. I used to hate dolphin because like my shoulders didn't bend that way, you know, but it's just like spending time with it, breathing with it. And now it's like, it's where I start my practice. I feel like I do shoulder stand every day, you know, it's just because like it feels good now. And it feels like something that's like accessible and it like, yeah, nourishing. So you start to cultivate the meditation practice, because the whole idea of doing yoga in the first place is so you can sit longer. The whole idea of any posture is to prepare your body to sit longer so you can spend more time in meditation and more time doing this inner work. I feel like before I started stretching, I had this really wide view of spirituality and that everybody feels it for themselves. And like I truly feel that the passions that you feel inside of yourself and those moments of just like yes, and passion and fire, I feel like that's God. I feel like that's just like a breath through you, because like a lot of those times if you talk to people that are in those like flow state, people call it flow state, or people call it just like being inspired, like they're not thinking. Before I started yoga, I noticed that there was a lot of divides between people and that sense of release that had brought a lot of clarity for me before. And I was trying to give people this thing, and I was trying to there was points where I would call it out where it was happening and be like, you're doing this, you're creating this for yourself, like it's all your fault. And I wouldn't say it in those words, but basically that's what I was saying to people was, this is all your fault. Like, why are you doing this to yourself? And in the practice of doing this, what I've really realized is like, people were trying to give me this all along. And I never could have taken it unless I went there and picked it up for myself. And so like realizing that for myself, it's the same with everybody. Like you can't teach anybody anything. You can't really force anybody to like heal or to progress, you know, but you can lay down little breadcrumbs for them to pick up, because people are curious, you know, and people are innately, they want to know something beyond themselves. And if they see someone that's doing something that they feel like they want for themselves, they want to go there. And I feel like the other kind of thing that I've learned is you can't make it a flashy thing. You can't, because like there's so many of these Instagram yogis that are trying to like give people something, but they're doing it while doing a handstand, and they're doing it while like, and do this and this back bend and this, and it's like you can't set that divide, because a lot of people can't move like that, you know, and then it becomes a thing of I can't do that, you know, and it's something that everybody can do. Everybody has the space inside themselves to take a seat and breathe, you know, and that's all yoga is. That's all yoga is ever supposed to be, is sitting and breathing. And, you know, and it's like we make so many of these things about how I'm looking in it, or like how do I look, am I doing it right? And there is no right way to sit and breathe. You know, there are ways to improve the diaphragmatic system, and there are ways to, you know, expand ourselves, but it's not right or wrong, you know. And it's like that's the biggest thing that I've learned is like I can't teach anybody anything, and there's no right way to do it. It's just how you're doing it, and it's the intention, really. I feel like yoga is more an act of intention than an act of moving physically, because like a lot of the things are like, how present are you? How much are you really breathing? How much are you really focusing on these things? Because like I could look a lot better than the person next to me, but it could just be like, moving through my practice, you know? And it just could be because I'm flexible, because I was innately gifted to have more limber limbs than the person next to me. And that's not yoga, you know? And yoga isn't like how flexible I am or like any of these things. It's like, how much am I paying attention to this moment? How much am I integrating this concentration, this really just focus and devotion to what's happening right now? And so yeah, that's the biggest thing that's come out of all of this, and that I've learned is that like it's just about the intention. That's the biggest thing. It's like, how much are we really giving to this? So that's how much you're getting back, you know.
It's really good. That feels good.
Everybody can breathe. That's a big truth.
Yeah.
And if you can't, you could breathe where you're at, you know. You got asthma, you got respiratory problems, there are things you could do, you know. And it's like, even if you have disabilities, like there are things that you could do. Like everybody has some sort of range of motion, and if you're paraplegic and you can't move, you can sit and breathe. And you probably have the best yoga practice because you could sit and breathe without pain, you know? And it's like, there's just so many things you could do, and it's all about where your mind is, and it's all about like where your focus is. And it's a practice of moving your focus. It's a practice of like taking this, putting it on one thing, and then moving it around. So big. Everybody can do it. I hope you do it.
One of the most important insights that I feel like I discovered through studying and talking, and that Frank discovered through stretching and breathing, is this discovery of a spirituality rooted in the earth and in the flesh. And contrary to popular Christian conservative language, the flesh isn't bad. The flesh isn't evil. Our bodies are not evil. Matter, everything we see and touch around us, is not evil. We don't need to escape it. And the Christians that talk like we do seem to be reading the Bible starting in Genesis 3 and the story about humanity's original sin, instead of starting in Genesis 1 in the poem about humanity's original blessing, the planet's original blessing, called very good. All of it called very good. We start there. And this idea of original blessing is at the root of most religions, definitely Christianity, following along the Hebrew Bible, and of course in the story of the incarnation, with God becoming flesh. And this idea that matter is evil, and that we need to escape this world, and that's how salvation comes, is a poison that has been within Christianity ever since the beginning through this heresy called Gnosticism. And Gnosticism was a very early heresy that even the earliest Christians fell prey to. Gnostics have a very dualistic view of the world, seeing a very sharp contrast between the physical and the spiritual, even seeing everything that's physical as evil and everything spiritual as good. And they had this heavy emphasis on secret knowledge and sought to attain this secret knowledge and believed salvation would come through this secret knowledge. Gnosis in Greek means knowledge. And they believed that this evil lesser god created this evil corrupt planet and trapped the divine spark within creation, and talked about how we need to find the divine spark within all things. But ultimately, salvation would come through escaping our bodies, like Jesus did when he died on the cross. Now, there are people who are inspired today by some Gnostic ideas in a positive way, and I've been inspired by some Gnostic ideas in some old Gnostic texts, like the Gospel of Thomas, for example, but I cannot accept the larger vision of Gnosticism. But I do see the appeal. The beautiful part of Gnosticism is that it recognizes the divine, sacred spirit within all human bodies and talk about how that spirit gives the body value. And that's a powerful message in a world where the value of our bodies is determined by the condition of our bodies or by what we do for the powerful in society. But Gnosticism gets very troubling when it teaches that that divine spirit within you is the only valuable thing about you. Even if it would never straight out say that so bluntly, that's the message that gets sort of communicated when you always talk about spirit positively and always talk about our bodies and the earth negatively. If the only good thing about me is something that I cannot sensually engage with, something that I cannot see, hear, touch, taste, smell, then that doesn't really do me much good. And it becomes obvious why the natural conclusion of this worldview is that ultimate salvation fully comes through escaping this body, through becoming nothing but spirit. Christian language that pushes us out of the earth is Gnosticism and is not at the root of Christianity. And I believe as long as there is an obsession with transcendence and otherworldly future utopias, the Gnosticism will remain a poison within Christianity. There's a lot of Christians that are pretty Gnostic in their theology without even realizing it, in their very dualistic view of the world, of the physical and the spiritual. In fact, there are a lot of Christians that are pretty much soft deists. Deists believe that God created the universe and then separated apart from the universe and just left it to be completely on its own, never to be bothered again by this God. And there's a lot of Christians that seem to believe everything that a deist believes, except they add that this God can return and intervene through answering our prayers, and then leaves again until called upon again by our prayers. I feel like that view really doesn't align with the radical vision of early Christianity. And that's a view that I strongly reject as part of a theology of embodiment. There is no dualism in a theology of embodiment. Elisabeth moltmann-wendel, in the book I Am My Body, says, "A theology of embodiment mistrusts all abstract spirituality which is dissociated from the body, life, earth, and social relationships. It trusts all embodiment which speaks from a concrete, involved spirit, moved by eros and related to the cosmos. Disembodiment is lovelessness. Insecurity, coldness, power, and wariness are hidden behind abstraction. A theology of embodiment mistrusts all self-made fantasies of the beyond, which are engaged in at the expense of the healing of people here and the realization of the kingdom of God on this earth. It is committed to a this-worldly expectation, which here already looks for full, complete life, for wide spaces for women and men, and from this work derives the hope that nothing can separate us from the life and the love of God." This is the type of theology I'm talking about. A theology that does its best to do theology from the body outward, from the earth up, instead of attempting to do theology from the sky down. I'm also reminded of one of my favorite lesser-known poems by Walt Whitman, who had a very deep understanding of the sacredness of nature and bodies, and I'm very inspired by him in this way of thinking. And he wrote this little poem, and he said, "Priests, until you can explain a paving stone, do not try to explain God. Until your creeds can do as much as apples and hen's eggs, let down your eyebrows a little. Until your Bibles and prayer books are able to walk like me, and until your brick and mortar can procreate as I can, I beg you, sirs, do not presume to put them above me." I would summarize that poem in my own words by saying, if you can't convince the person you're talking to of the divinity within them and around them, don't waste your time trying to convince them of any divinity from out the heavens. And what's funny is, I think most religious people would agree with me when I say that religion is about what we do on this earth and how we relate to one another. But then they would add all this stuff about divine beings and spiritual realms and future judgments and utopias. But I just want to stop here after saying religion is about what we do on this earth and how we relate to one another. And that makes a lot of religious people very uncomfortable. They don't want to just stop there. Well, let's give ourselves permission to just stop here for a while. And let's give ourselves grace, if we're comfortable, to remain here and not move up from here with our religious language. And coming from the Christian tradition, I feel like we have the grace to remain here with our religious language, especially because the originating ideas of the earliest movement of Christianity were all about bodies.
I miss my soul, my friend, again. I miss my soul, I miss my mouth, again. La, 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 la.
When studying the uniqueness of Christianity, we shouldn't be looking for what makes Christianity the most correct religious tradition or the most effective religious tradition. Instead, we should be looking for what are the unique gifts of Christianity that can serve the world alongside all the other unique gifts that other religions offer to the world. I think when Christians begin to be more open and inclusive to people of other faiths, they feel like they need to minimize their passion for their specific religious tradition in order to be more open and inclusive. But in actuality, you can still be just as passionate and just as vocal about your particular religious tradition, but we just need to frame it differently. Framing it as, here is the tradition where I pull from in order to offer our unique gifts to the world, and I am also open and celebrate the other unique gifts offered by other religious traditions, and I'm in solidarity with all these other religious traditions offering their own unique gifts to serve the world. So when we ask what makes Christianity unique, the most significant answer to that question is the incarnation of God made flesh, God embodied in human beings, beginning by noticing and celebrating God enfleshed in Jesus of Nazareth. Early Christians looked at the world and said, what the Jews have been saying is happening in the temple, and what the pagans have been saying is happening in the earth, we are now saying is happening carnally in human bodies. This is why the Gospels talk about the curtain in the temple ripping apart when Jesus is crucified, and why Matthew talks about these Gentile, pagan, star-following wise men looking for God and being led by the stars and finding God hidden inside the body of this baby. That is what makes Christianity unique. Not that it's the most correct or the most just or the most graceful, but the symbols at the center of the origin of this movement was always the incarnation of God enfleshed through humans. And our bodies in loving community make up what the Apostle Paul called the body of Christ. The incarnation is not a one-time event. God continues to incarnate. When John chapter 1 says the Word became flesh, that's saying the Word became all flesh. Christianity calls us to experience God enfleshed in Jesus, and that enables us to experience God enfleshed in us and the people around us. And in the New Testament letters of the Apostle Paul, he suggests that there are no limits to the type of bodies that are accepted in the body of Christ. The dominant narrative among Christians during Paul's lifetime was that when Gentiles become Christians, they should be circumcised like the Jewish Christians were. Paul fights against this until his death. So one of the earliest unique messages of Christianity was that all bodies are accepted in the body of Christ, no matter the state your body is in. When I read that, I think Christians should have been the first ones to embrace trans people. especially because we're supposed to be the religion that believes all bodies are sacred and that you don't have to do anything to your body to change that. And even if you do something to your body, it still doesn't change it. Christianity as the religion of the body should have been at the forefront of all issues regarding diverse bodies every time. But it seems like this radical vision that all bodies are accepted into the body of Christ was so radical that it's taken us 2,000 years to even begin to grasp it. The feminist theologian Sallie McFague also wrote an embodied theology book called The Body of God, an Ecological theology. In that book, she also talks about the uniqueness of Christianity in this way. She says, as the incarnational religion par excellence, Christianity can offer its basic belief in divine enfleshment, its theology of embodiment in which God, human beings, and everything else in the cosmos are knit together. Christianity can also offer to the planetary agenda its vision of the liberation, healing, and inclusion of the oppressed, and in our day, that must include vulnerable nature. Christianity is the incarnational religion par excellence. This is our unique gift to offer the world alongside all the other unique gifts from other religions. In that book, Sallie McFague also defines sin as the refusal to share basic necessities of survival with other bodies. And I love that. There really is a way to frame all Christian theological language from the body outward, from the earth up, not the sky down. And I would really say that that's actually good enough without the need for transcendent language in order to make it really Christian. In the Catholic tradition, they talk about the works of mercy as important spiritual practices. And there are the corporal works of mercy and the spiritual works of mercy, all of which based on scriptures. Most of the corporal works of mercy are based on Jesus' parable of the sheep and the goats, when he said, "Whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me." Those works of corporal mercy are to feed the hungry, to give water to the thirsty, to clothe the naked, to shelter the homeless, to visit the sick, to visit the imprisoned, and to bury the dead. The spiritual works of mercy, based on other scriptures, are to instruct the ignorant, to counsel the doubtful, to admonish the sinners, to bear patiently those who wrong us, to forgive others, to comfort the afflicted, to pray for the living and the dead. It's interesting to look at both those lists because I feel like those of us who grew up in church probably heard a lot more talk of those spiritual works of mercy, even if they didn't call them the works of mercy. And we hardly ever heard talk of the corporal works of mercy. Even if we did, we hardly ever saw those works of mercy done as much as we saw the spiritual works of mercy done. In fact, I feel like the reason so many people felt like they fell out of step with the church and felt like they had to leave was because the more that they looked at Jesus and studied Jesus, the more they desired stuff from that first list of works of mercy, and then looked at their church and just saw the second list. Here's what's really interesting though. You may be expecting me to say that we need to follow both lists, like many Christians out there may say. But consider this. We've heard so many stories of people leaving the church because they felt like their church was only following that second list, and therefore didn't look like the Jesus that they were taught about. But you never hear stories of people leaving their church because their church was only following that first list. When you experience a community that fully follows both lists, it's great. But when you experience a community that only follows that first list of those corporal works of mercy, you still feel like this is a community that is passionately and faithfully following the way of Jesus. And so I think the corporal works of mercy are actually the most important and could be followed on their own and still be enough for you to be considered a faithful follower of Jesus. And some may say, no, you need both in order to be an actual faithful follower of Jesus. Or you at least need the spiritual, because this is a spiritual thing. But Jesus told his followers, they'll know you by your fruit. And that fruit is most visible in the corporal works of mercy. That word corporal comes from the Latin corpus, which means body, by the way. So practicing both the corporal works of mercy and the spiritual works of mercy is great. But if you only follow the spiritual works of mercy, your life ends up not looking that much like the life of Jesus. But if you only follow the corporal works of mercy, it ends up being enough for your life to look like the life of Jesus. If your only Christian language is asking, who are the next people we gotta feed, then that's enough. Sallie McFague also wrote, the model of the world as God's body encourages us to dare to love bodies and find them valuable and wonderful. Just that and nothing more. The God part will take care of itself if we can love and value the bodies. This is what an incarnational theology assures us. It is all right to have a nature spirituality. In fact, we should have one. When we talk about the world as the body of God, we are talking about the God that Paul describes in the book of Acts, when he says that God is in whom we live and move and have our being. And to experience that God requires engaging the senses. It can involve engaging the intellect as well, but in that case, the ultimate purpose of the intellect there would be to interpret our sensual engagement with God. And that's when we start to get to speculation. Before speculation and theology and symbols and metaphors, God is experienced through our embodied existence. And that's enough. The 13th century German mystic Meister Eckhart said, if I spent enough time with the tiniest creature, even a caterpillar, I would never have to prepare a sermon. So full of God is every creature. There are all kinds of ways of discovering the wisdom we need while we're on this planet. But one of the most important things we must discover, no matter how you discover it, is that we are all bodies in relation with one another. And we all need space in this world for our bodies to survive. I am disgusted with all the complicated theories that try to justify certain bodies being taken care of while other bodies are not. We all know that we all need to make sure that we all survive here. And if the only way you can articulate that is just how I said it, then that's enough. If all you can say as a Christian is, hey, we need to do everything we can to take care of one another, then that is enough for you to call yourself a Christian. And if all you can say as a socialist is, hey, we need to do everything we can to take care of one another, that is enough to call yourself a socialist too. And as for those of us who understand this stuff on a deeper intellectual level, may we continue to help people along the way get to where they need to be, instead of trying to force people to know everything we know. I am my body, and we all live within the body politic. And our bodies live in the body of God that is our planet. And we exist as bodies in relation to one another, making space for one another. Let's keep talking about important issues, but let's try starting conversations there and see where they take us. thank you for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe to watch more videos like this. Leave a comment, let me know what you're thinking. And also make sure to follow me on Twitch, twitch.tv/whoisdamon, where we can talk about this kind of stuff in a more free-form and interactive way. And if you would like to support me, I'd greatly appreciate it. You can check out my Patreon, patreon.com/Damon Garcia. And let's end this video by shouting out my patrons already over there. Keith Wetzel, Stephen Harp, Ranger Jenny, Refined Your Scene, James Finlay, New Transcendentalist, Kristen Mouse, Mike Togman, Peter John Blake, Mimi McGann, Kali, Onion, Keegan James, Tammy D, Erica Guzzo, Sam Osakwe, Marina Black, and everyone else. I greatly appreciate the support. So go check out my Patreon if you like my videos and all that. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.